Now, after Jesus returned to the Galilee, he first went to Nazareth. That's where he grew up. But he was rejected in Nazareth. That's recorded in Luke chapter 4 if you're taking notes. And so he moved from Nazareth to Capernaum. Look at verse 13. And leaving Nazareth, he came and dwelt in Capernaum, which is by the sea, that would be the Sea of Galilee, in the regions of Zebulun and Naphtali, that it might be fulfilled, which was spoken by Isaiah the prophet, saying, the land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali, by the way of the sea beyond the Jordan, Galilee of the Gentiles. The people who sat in darkness have seen a great light, and upon those who sat in the region and shadow of death, light has dawned. Now, Capernaum will become Jesus' headquarters for the next 2 years until he goes to the cross to die for the sins of the world. In Matthew chapter 9, verse 1, Capernaum is called his own his own city. Today, if you go to the city of Capernaum, the ancient city of Capernaum, on the gate to the city, it says Capernaum, the town of Jesus. I like that. Now, this move to Capernaum was a strategic move for his ministry. Nazareth was a small village of maybe 300 to 400 people, and it was off all of the main roads. It was kind of in the middle of nowhere. It was up in the mountains on a ridge, and it was difficult to get to, and it was isolated. Most importantly, it was isolated from the outside world. Capernaum is the opposite of Nazareth. Capernaum was a city. More importantly, it sat on the major trade route in the Middle East, called the Via Maris, or the Way of the Sea, that connected Europe and Asia and Africa. So anybody traveling, any traders traveling through Europe, Asia, Africa, they pass right by the city of Capernaum. So Capernaum was an international city with people from all over the world passing through that town all the time. So by moving to Capernaum, Jesus would reach a much broader audience, and the news of Jesus will spread quickly throughout the region, as we're going to see later in chapter 4. Notice also that this move to Capernaum fulfilled Old Testament prophecy. Again, we see that in verse 14, that it might be fulfilled, which was spoken by Isaiah the prophet. And then Matthew quotes the prophecy in verses 15 and 16. The land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali were two separate areas that bordered each other, much like Maryland and Virginia. And note the order given in this prophecy. Zebulun is mentioned first, then Naphtali. Nazareth was in the land of Zebulun, and Capernaum was in Naphtali. So Jesus moved from Zebulun to Naphtali. So even the names are given in the correct order in this prophecy. And this prophecy is from the book of Isaiah chapter 9. It's written about 800 years before Christ. Notice in verse 15, the way of the sea is mentioned. That's that major trade route that passed by Capernaum, the Via Maris. And the area is called Galilee of the Gentiles. Galilee of the Gentiles. Now, why is it called Galilee of the Gentiles? It's called Galilee of the Gentiles because in the days of Isaiah, the Assyrians invaded the territory from the north on that Via Maris, and they conquered the Galilee. And they took most of the Jewish people that were living in the Galilee away as slaves to Assyria. And then the Assyrians brought Gentiles or non-Jews from other regions into the Galilee area and resettled them there, repopulated the Galilee with Gentiles from elsewhere. So the Galilee had a large Gentile population. Even in the days of Jesus, it still had a large Gentile population. The prophecy here is that the Messiah will come to Galilee of the Gentiles, not Jerusalem, but to Galilee of the Gentiles. The fact that Jesus spent most of his ministry in Galilee of the Gentiles emphasizes that Jesus came to be the Savior of the whole world. Not just Jews, not Jews only, but the Savior of anyone who puts their trust in him and his death and resurrection. It's something, what he's doing here is much bigger than just the Jewish people. as we're going to see. Look at verse 16. It says, the people who sat in darkness have seen a great light, and upon those who sat in the region and shadow of death. That's Galilee, because when foreign empires would invade, they would invade into the Galilee. So they lived in the shadow of death constantly. Upon them light has dawned. Listen, any person who is living without Christ sits in darkness and lives in the shadow of death constantly. Jesus came to call us out of darkness, spiritual darkness. John chapter 8, verse 12, Jesus said, I am the light of the world. He who follows me shall not walk in darkness, but have the light, of life. Those living in the Galilee, sitting in spiritual darkness, living in the shadow of death, under the threat of death constantly, to them, the light of the Messiah, Jesus Christ, came. I love this. Not to the religious people down in Jerusalem, but to Galilee of the Gentiles, to people sitting in darkness, to people living in the shadow of death. Jesus came. Verse 17 says, from the time he moved to Capernaum, Jesus began to preach. And I want you to note that here. He began to preach. Now, Jesus, of course, is God, and Jesus could have done anything he wanted to reveal himself to mankind and to communicate his message to mankind. And what did Jesus do? He chose to preach. Of all the things, he chose to preach. Preaching was his method of getting his message out to the world. I don't know, isn't that something? The God of the universe? I mean, he could arrange the stars to spell it out. You know, he could have flocks of birds spell out words if he wanted. You know, he could do anything. He chooses to preach. That's his method. And what did Jesus command us to do? Go into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature. All of us here, we're commanded to preach. We're commanded to be preachers of the gospel. So what does it mean to preach? The word preach means to proclaim, or to declare, or to publish a message. Preaching, listen, preaching is not arguing with somebody. Preaching is not debating. Preaching is not trying to convince someone. Preaching is not even a dialogue or a discussion or a conversation. You hear that a lot now. We're going to have a conversation. To preach is to simply state the truth of what God tells you to state. To preach is to make a declaration, and then people either believe the truth stated or they refuse to believe.